Our third speaker is Associate Professor Paul Williams, who is the Principal Hospital Scientist at RPA. And most notably, I think, he's been the AACB representative and currently is, I believe, to the IFCC Working Party on free hormone measurement for thyroid hormones. And I think that's really important for getting that world harmonisation and agreement. He's been the president... When we get it, yes. He's been the president of the Australian Diabetes Society, serving on the board of the Diabetes Australia for 12 years, and has been an AACB member for the last 13 years. And I'm very glad to have you here to present. Thank you.
It was a pretty daunting prospect to have to come and speak to this, first of all, because my major experience with HPLC is hemoglobin A1C. So I don't have them. I'm mainly an immunoassay person and have been for quite a while, and I happened to notice on the program that the person in front of me was going to start talking about measuring free hormones by HPLC. So I had to sort of think about a different way in which I was going to try and move it forward. Now, we already are very familiar that hormones are usually bound to proteins in the circulation, mainly because of solubility problems or delivery problems. So we've got sex hormone binding globulin binds all the steroid hormones, thyroid binding globulin the thyroid hormones, corticosteroid binding globulin binds the corticosteroids, plus progesterone. That always confused me because I didn't think about that one. Then we've got IGF binding proteins, binding IGF-1 and IGF-2. And unfortunately, we do have patients where we've got prolactin bound and it's not available in the circulation. And that's probably the one thing where I really think we do have to measure the free prolactin, because it's been fairly well shown that macroprolactin doesn't get to biologically active situation at any time. Of the rest, I suppose it's what we routinely measure. We measure total 25-hydroxyvitamin D, not the free, because we're measuring the reservoir of what's available and what can be available for making the free. We measure total cortisol, and we seem to have fairly good correlation to our clinical situation for that. In the USA, due to the influence of one particular personality, total T4 is measured in preference to free T4. It's one of the few countries that does measure that. Urinary free cortisol, very interesting, because everybody said this is going to be the answer, because we know that the extraction of urinary free cortisol is difficult, fraught with problems. The QC will tell you that it doesn't work properly. So everybody said HPLC, EMS will be the wonderful answer. But what we found is that some of the metabolites are actually important to add back into that in order to be able to get the clinical relevance, because the plain peak is was shown with Anne McCormack's study. It doesn't coincide with just the straight cortisol peak. You have to have the metabolites there. Most protein-drowned drugs are still measured as total. Free phenytoin, as you've said before, is a very good example of that. And what they do in that case is usually crashing the protein and select it into a suitable solvent, such as happens for the immune suppression drugs and other things. And I was looking through for a reference to that to see if that was really true, and I did a very quick search, and I came up with a bioanalysis paper in 2017, which basically said that most of them really are doing that. So I was reassured about that I wasn't going to make a terrible mistake in trying to move forward on that position. Did I skip on? Yes, I did. The principles and pitfalls of free hormone concentration. Now, James Fay has become the president of the IFCC committee for the standardisation of thyroid hormones, taking over from Linda Thienpont. And he did a review very, very recently in a best practice clinical endocrinology and metabolism. And in one of those things, he covers not only the free hormone concentration for the thyroid hormones, but he also talks about steroid and vitamin D and other ones in some of the chapters. But he states that the free hormones' physiological dependence on the free the physiological effect depends upon the free hormone concentrations, and that the reason that so many of them are protein bound is because they're not soluble in blood. So you've got vitamin D and thyroxine, both classified very clearly as poorly or slightly soluble in water. The measurement of free hormones appears logical, but this hypothesis has engendered significant controversy over the past several decades. And one of the proposers of this has been Roger Ekins. He's followed up now by his successor, who's now taking the argument, and I'll show you some of his arguments later on that were out in Clinical Chemistry about 4 or 5 years ago. Ekins, in his Endocrine Reviews article, which you can really hold up as being one of the best analysis of the measurement of free hormone in blood at that stage, and this also precedes the advent of HPLC, MS. I must say that would make a significant difference, because I think without any shadow of a doubt, the measurement of the concentration at very low levels and of a lot of these compounds is certainly dependent upon HPLC, MS. But it's the process to get to the free level that is where the compound problem is, and I think that's where we really are sitting in a query situation. The free hormone hypothesis relies upon the fact that when a free hormone diffuses across the capillaries, it's going to be immediately replaced by the protein-bound reservoir. Now, we already know that KD stipulates that there's going to be a time delay, and you're not going to get that immediately happening because dissociation is not an immediate process. Burstein has an entirely different proposal, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a second about how these two might fit together. And he said that the hormone is depleted progressively as it moves along the capillary, and it's dependent upon the blood flow through the capillary to the target organ that is going to determine the free hormone concentration that's available. Both of those rely upon the fact that you do have a dissociable component. And just to say that maybe the argument about not getting enough free hormone and it all being into the tissue and still being bound can be illustrated by the argument there where the free T4 dissociation at 1.1 to 3.3 by 10 to the 7th micrograms per minute is 10 to 20% of the generation rate of which you can generate free T4. So there is an argument that this might be a possibility. It's unproven, and I don't think we'll ever get an experiment that really will help us. This really illustrates the problem in the way that Ekins first said, because in the first case, you've got blood passing through the capillary, and the first little bit, as you can see, gets the whoop. How do I get back to there? There we go, it's all right. I just pressed the wrong buttons. You can see as it progresses along the capillary, you lose all of the free hormone and the rest proceeds through, and the tissue is not going to be exposed to any concentration. The second one says that as the blood flow comes through, you're progressively losing it and passing through. So the rate of this blood passing through is going to be the rate of delivery of the free hormone. If T4 dissociates in a half-life of 1 second, it's going to have a lifespan of 1.4 milliseconds in the circulation. Bound to TBG, it's got a half-life of about 40 seconds, which means it can last about 57 seconds. All theoretical calculations, but just something to make people think about what might be possibly happening. And the other concept that really has puzzled me, in fact, does protein binding limit the amount available to the tissues? And we know with IGF-1 we have a classic example where that's not true, because in fact the IGF binding proteins are there to deliver the binding proteins to certain things. And the classic example of that is the placenta, where it's actually PAP-A that breaks down the IGF-BP3 and releases the IGF-1 and makes it biologically active. Increasing protein-bound material in the capillary should enhance the delivery of free hormone to these tissues because it allows it to last long enough in the circulation to be able to reach tissues at the far end of the body. Otherwise, how would it reach it? With a short half-life of 1.4, 1.8 milliseconds, it's never going to get there. The free hormone hypothesis is still the only valid basis, and I think that's the problem we have, that we're never going to prove it either way unless we're going to do an awful experiment with a whole lot of humans. And I don't think we're going to get ethical approval for that one under any circumstances at this stage. The other thing is, A lot of mammals don't have binding proteins. The rodents have no sex hormone binding globulins. Rats don't have it, and yet overexpression doesn't change the phenotype. So there's no change in what's going on. It's very confusing. Why do humans need it? Rats don't. Mammals do. Other forms don't. There's no binding globulins in reptiles. There's no binding globulins in the other mammals. Mammals have it. We don't. Other animals don't. So is it something that it's a delivery process that's different in mammals, or is it something else? It's something we need to think about. And one of the things that one of the particular Australian has been fighting for quite a long period of time is the concept about free testosterones. And David Handelsman has always said that total testosterone is the way we have to measure, and that free testosterone is just a waste of time, effort, and a huge amount of energy. He had a recent review in Endocrine Reviews where he was commenting upon a paper that came out, which is a standardisation by HPLC MSMS of the free testosterone. And it went through and compared all the immunoassays and showed that they were totally hopeless at measuring it in females, and we already knew that. And it also showed that you could do it, but there was still no real evidence presented in that whole thing that the free testosterone was the component that was most important rather than the total. IGF binding proteins. Now, I've never seen so many binding proteins for just one single molecule. We've got some that are nutritionally regulated. We've got some that are developmentally regulated. We've got IGF-BP3, which is the major one secreted by the tissue, and you can't get IGF-1 without IGF-BP3 being secreted. It then has to complex with the acid labile subunit, and then it's kept in the circulation because that's a very large molecule. But then IGF-BP3 is made in many tissues, and if some of you heard Rob Baxter speaking about it yesterday, the day before, you would have seen that it's actually a process whereby a cell releases its own IGF, bound to IGF-BP3, proteolyses the BP3, and then the BP3 released goes into the nucleus and becomes active. Now, vitamin D is another one that is a binding protein, and vitamin D binding protein also ends up in the nucleus. And we don't know what it's doing there yet, but we know that it ends up there, and maybe its biological function is there, and maybe the reason that we see so many relationships of all disease processes with vitamin D is because the binding protein is doing something. I don't know. It's a pure speculation as to whether we would be able to ever answer that question. IGF-BP3s all have biological actions of their own, and they've been shown in quite a number one. And the example I gave early on with proteolysis of IGBPs by Papain in the placenta results in 60% less IGF-1 and 20% less postnatal growth in the fetus. It's essential to stop IGF's binding and acting at the insulin receptor because the concentration of IGF, if it was free in the circulation, is 1,000-fold higher than insulin, and everybody would be hypoglycemic. It really extends the half-life of IGF-1 to 16 hours, and I think it's very important to think about that. Ekins also has problems with the way in which we can try and measure free hormones. Does dilution differ from dialysis? And he's done a lot of experiments and he's produced a lot of results. But see, in dilution, the fall in free hormone detected is equal to the predicted concentration of free hormone. But that is only assuming we have a perfect assay to measure the free hormone, which we don't at the moment. Dialysis has semipermeable membranes separating the protein bound from the diffused hormone. Dilution does not and can allow the hormone to be rebound in the whole system all the way through. So you have to be careful. The other thing is if you're using dialysis or you're using ultrafiltration, ultrafiltration doesn't have an equal volume on both sides of the membrane. Are you capable, therefore, of forming a proper equilibrium? Because you're essentially moving the free constantly at the whole time, causing further dissociation. That question I really don't think has been answered at any one time. Dialysis has the advantage that the total volume of buffer present on both sides has to be taken into account when you're working out what the equilibrium might be. So it's a question of trying to work out what is the best measurement and how we should be doing it. It's really quite a difficult decision. This is just an example illustrating the previous point that I just talked about. And here is some of the other arguments by Midgley, who's taken up where Eakins left off and has carried the argument further forward. And he says that if you have a manometer on the side of the pool that you're measuring where you're constantly sampling the free, you can probably get a better idea of what's actually happening. Whereas if you have a semi-permeable membrane where you're only measuring what's coming through on the other side, you may not be able to get a good measurement. And his argument for this was taken with the free T4 and free T3 assays, where he said that we certainly have a problem. And we know we have, and I'll show you where the real problem is. If you're going to measure affinity by equilibrium dialysis, then you've got to be able to set the system up so that you're capable of matching both sides. And as we are going to be fully aware, the IFCC had to set up a reference method, and they had to then publish a reference method for how you were going to do equilibrium dialysis. And it had to obey the C45A consensus guidelines for the reference procedure. The ionic composition of the buffer has to equal that of the serum. The pH of the buffer and the serum have to be the same. The temperature has to be constant and controlled to plus or minus 5 degrees. The sample cannot be diluted before dialysis, and the final dilution at the end of dialysis doesn't exceed the 1 to 2 dilution inherent in the fact that you've got two equal sides of the buffer. The highest quality reagents used, and they have to be extremely well done. The buffer has to have a specific concentration, and she specifies this down to the concentration, the time of mixing, and everything else. The dialysis cell has to be made of Teflon. It's got to have a volume of 1.36 mils. It's amazing definition of where you have to go through this. It has to have 3 holes. One for air displacement, one to fill, and a separate hole in another area, completely separate and well removed to be able to remove the fluid from the other side. You have to clean the cells with 2% RBS detergent and wash thoroughly, completely. And membrane of regenerated cellulose and a cutoff of 5 kilodaltons needs to be pre-acrylated before you're going to use, and everything else. This takes 4 hours at 37 degrees, must be strictly controlled. It's not going to be an easy process to measure it using the equilibrium dialysis according to the reference standard method. You've got to adjust the pH of the serum by adding concentrated Heppy's buffer before you start. You've got to keep it agitated the whole time. You've got to collect the dialysate in Teflon pipettes, and you've got to reconstitute in a known volume before HPLC and SMS. We now have seen that there's a TCAN system for automated equilibrium dialysis. I don't know if this meets all the requirements, but it certainly might be one way in which we might be able to meet some of the requirements that are going to be if we're ever going to have a high throughput assay that can allow us to measure free hormones. We've already seen this situation, and I agree with you about the problem with thyroid assays, and this is a classic example where you've got all the different assays measuring the same serum, and they're giving totally different volumes. And then the straight line at the top is where Thienpont's assay actually runs. So we're obviously under-measuring, and we're measuring differently in all the different assays, and we're doing some things that we really shouldn't be doing. We now know we have a procedure for measuring the free hormone concentration. We have a reference methodology for doing it. We've got an equation to be able to correct all the assays, and we still don't have assays that are going to give an agreement. And we're not going to get assays that are going to give an agreement until we get one of the manufacturers is going to give in and say, yes, I'm going to do it, and then all of them are going to follow on. But until that time, we're going to be stuck. So I say that we've got time yet to see this. And I suppose the assays are dependent upon the process. We've got a two-step assay, we've got a single-step assay, and we also have a labelled hormone with a modified two-step assay. Both of these systems are currently in use, but all of them depend upon the fact that you take a very small amount of the free hormone without disturbing the equilibrium, which I think represents the first problem. Then you don't separate it in one case, you do separate it in the other. So you get rid of the rebinding, so you can't get it in the two-step assay. In the single-step assay, you don't separate that. So you've always got the chance that you're going to get rebinding and redistribution through the assay. So that to me represents a problem, and that may start to explain why you've got an exponential increase when you get to higher concentrations in that particular assay. I think we have to take into account that antibodies, as we know them, don't behave as perfect binding situations. They go from a high affinity situation from 10 to the minus 11, 10 to the minus 12, 10 to the minus 13 molar, to a low affinity situation of 10 to the minus 8, 10 to the minus 9, a thousand-fold difference, simply by the fact that they're being occupied. So the more hormone you have bound, the more things you have bound to an antibody, the lower the affinity of that antibody to actually continue binding. So the chance of it being able to rebind at high concentrations is very high. The chance of being able to rebind at low concentrations to a binding protein, which still has the same high affinity as the antibody had at that stage, is going to be very difficult. So we have to take into account the physical constraints of the reagents that we have in our hands at the moment. So I think that there's advantages and disadvantages for equilibrium dialysis. There's advantages to immunoassay, there's time. Problem is we need calibration, and we need it calibrated to reference standard methodologies, and I think that's where HPLC is going to provide those methodologies that are going to allow us to standardise assays to measure the proper values and give us better clinical significance for a lot of their assays. Thanks very much.
Paul, very provocative and fantastic, thank you. I think it really comes down to outcomes and looking, you did a wonderful job summarizing all of the analytical chemistry that we bash our head against the wall with every day. But really, at the end of the day, it is which one of these assays, which we're just measuring a different biomarker in each assay, which biomarker is it that the outcome that predicts the outcome in a meaningful way clinically? Should we be going back to the RIA, for instance? Should we be doing radio-labeled tracers instead of all of these fancy things that we're talking about? Is an example question I have for you.
I think in that case, we have to go back and ask for help from our clinicians to be able to tell us what they find of the answers we're giving them are the most help in understanding their patients. And you know, when they don't get an answer that they like, they're going to ring you up straight away and they're going to say, I think your assay's wrong, you've done something, your calciums are off again, or something else has gone off. They'll ring you very quickly. And I think that's the thing. And I think Anne McCormack was very, very quick in Australia to raise the problem where the HPLC assay for urinary-free cortisol was brought out and said, here we have a wonderful assay, we're going to be able to measure free cortisol for the first time. And she said, yeah, but it doesn't correlate with what the patient's doing. And I think that's the sort of feedback we have to have. Instead of going right back to basics, I think we have to try and use our clinical associations, bring back the doctor and the relationship into the laboratory, which we've started to lose.
Thank you.
Can I just, comment on this one, because from my evidence-based sort of interest point of view, I fully agree with this outcome issue, but I think that that's the most important element, and the clinical observation is the most important reference standard, really. Whether my patient is getting better or not, depending on which result I used to treat this patient. But we have the probably largest, not research-funded, but actually, public-funded trial on Earth that we can actually use to prove this point, and that is that America uses total T4 and T3. All the rest of the world uses free T4 and free T3. Are those American patients managed any worse just because they use total hormones versus those ones who all around the world are managed by free hormone levels? So this is actually just a matter of collecting the data and looking at the clinical correlation of that data or the outcome of those patients, really, the thyroid patients. So I wonder whether we should be just utilizing the existing data to answer this question.
I don't think it's fair to say that in America we only use the total. A lot of reflexive strategies actually have free built into them, and we do listen to the rest of the world, not always, but I would say that we do measure total, how necessary or unnecessary it is, but I agree with you. what are we wasting, and what is the best biomarker of outcome? I think we really do need to get there, and I agree with you. The collaboration is important, and I agree that we already have a lot of data. I think we have statisticians here in the room who can help us sort it out. So.
Well, I might, on that note, actually thank Paul. Oh, don't go, don't go. I've got a present.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, and very provocative.